Good evening, drivers. Welcome back. Tonight, we're talking about something that never gets old, no matter how many times you do it: crossing state lines. And not just any state line, but one of the most significant borders in this country. The crossing from Illinois into Missouri. The crossing over the Mississippi River. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. A border's a border, right? You cross that imaginary line, see a different sign, maybe notice the road quality changes, and you keep rolling. But this crossing, this particular stretch where the Prairie State meets the Show Me State, it's different. It's always been different. And tonight, as we roll through the darkness with nothing but the hum of the engine and the glow of the dashboard, I want to tell you why. You see, when you cross from Illinois into Missouri, you're not just changing states. You're crossing the Mississippi River. And that river, well, that river has seen everything. It's watched empires rise and fall, seen steamboats give way to barges, witnessed the birth of cities and the death of dreams. Mark Twain called it the body of the nation, and he wasn't exaggerating. This river is the dividing line, the great artery, the liquid highway that split this country right down the middle and in doing so, defined it. I've made this crossing hundreds of times, maybe thousands. I've crossed it in every season, in every kind of weather, at every hour of the day and night. I've crossed it when the river was so low you could see sandbars that hadn't been exposed in decades. I've crossed it when the water was so high it lapped at the bridge supports and made you hold your breath, wondering if maybe this time the river might just decide it was done being contained. Each time is different. Each time tells a different story. Tonight, we're going to talk about those crossings. We're going to talk about the bridges that span this great river. We're going to talk about the cities that grew up on both banks. We're going to talk about the truck stops where drivers pause between states and the stories they tell over coffee and pie. We're going to talk about what it means to leave the flatlands of Illinois and roll into the rolling hills of Missouri, or to leave the gateway to the west and head back east into the land of Lincoln. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe pour yourself another cup of coffee or crack open that energy drink. We've got a long night ahead of us and a lot of miles to cover. Let's talk about crossing from Illinois into Missouri. Before we talk about bridges and crossings, before we talk about cities and states, we need to talk about the river itself. Because none of this exists without the Mississippi. None of this makes sense without understanding what it means to cross that brown, churning water. The Mississippi River is 1,481 miles long from its source at Lake Itasca in Minnesota, all the way down to where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico near New Orleans. Along that journey, it drains water from 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces. It's the 4th longest river in the world. It carries more than 500 million tons of sediment past its mouth every single year. The numbers are staggering, but numbers don't tell you what it feels like to be beside it. Numbers don't tell you about the power of it, the presence of it, the way it changes the air and the light and the sound of everything around it. I remember the first time I really saw the Mississippi. I mean really saw it, not just drove over it. I was a young driver, maybe 23 or 24, and I had some time to kill in St. Louis. I parked my rig and walked down to the riverfront, down to where you can stand right at the edge and watch the water slide past. It was hypnotic. The water was brown, thick with sediment, moving with this lazy, irresistible power. Logs and debris floated past. The current created these swirls and eddies that appeared and disappeared. And the sound. There was this constant low rush, like breathing, like the river was alive and it was letting you know it. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, just watching. And I thought about all the people who had stood in that same spot over the centuries. Native Americans who lived along these banks for thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. French traders and trappers who came down from Canada in birchbark canoes. Pioneers heading west on flatboats and rafts. Steamboat captains navigating by the light of pine knots burning in iron baskets. Soldiers during the Civil War. Railroad workers. river pilots, and now, all these years later, me, just another traveler trying to get from one side to the other. The Mississippi is more than a river. It's a boundary, yes, but it's also a connection. It's what separated the Louisiana Purchase from the original 13 colonies and their immediate territories. It's what made St. Louis the gateway to the West. It's what created 1,000 river towns, each one depending on the water for commerce, for transportation, for life itself. And it's dangerous. Make no mistake about that. This river has killed thousands of people over the years. It floods with a ferocity that's hard to comprehend until you've seen it. I've driven past places where you can see the high water marks on buildings, 10 or 15 or 20 feet above normal levels. Places where entire towns had to be evacuated. Places where the river just decided it was tired of staying in its channel and carved out a new path, drowning everything in its way. In 1993, the Great Flood lasted from April through October. The river crested at nearly 50 feet in St. Louis, 50 feet. Bridges were closed, highways were underwater, entire communities were cut off. The damage was in the billions. I wasn't driving yet back then, but I remember seeing the pictures on TV. The water just went on forever, brown and angry and unstoppable. And yet, for all its danger, the river is also life. It's always been life. The Native Americans knew it. The French knew it. The Americans who came after knew it. You settle near the river, you can trade, you can fish, you can transport goods. You can grow crops in the rich soil the river deposits when it floods. The river gives, and the river takes away, but it always shapes the land and the people around it. When you cross the Mississippi, you're crossing something primordial. You're crossing deep time. You're crossing a force of nature that was here long before humans walked this continent and will be here long after we're gone. The bridges we build are temporary. The cities we raise will eventually crumble. But the river will keep flowing. The river will keep carving its path to the sea. That's what you're crossing when you cross from Illinois into Missouri. That's what you need to understand. You're not just changing states, you're crossing the body of the nation. Let's start with the big one, the crossing everyone knows, the crossing that defines this border more than any other. St. Louis. If you're heading west on Interstate 70 or Interstate 55 or Interstate 64, you're going to cross the Mississippi at St. Louis, and you're going to do it on one of several bridges that span the river in this area. Each bridge has its own story. Each crossing has its own feel. The first thing you need to know about crossing at St. Louis is that it's busy. Really busy. We're talking about one of the major transportation hubs in the country. Trucks, cars, buses, everything. The traffic never stops. Even at 3 in the morning, you're going to see other vehicles. The river might sleep, but the bridges never do. Let's talk about the bridges themselves. The Poplar Street Bridge is probably the most well-known. It carries Interstates 55, 64, and used to carry 70 as well before they built the Musial Bridge. This bridge opened in 1967, and for decades it was the main crossing for all that interstate traffic. And it showed. By the early 2000s, the Poplar Street Bridge was carrying well over 100,000 vehicles a day. Some estimates put it at 125,000. That's more traffic than it was ever designed to handle. I remember driving that bridge back in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was always congested. Always. Morning rush hour, forget about it. You'd be crawling along, bumper to bumper, trucks and cars all mixed together. Evening rush, same thing. And even in the middle of the day, there were slowdowns. Accidents were common. People merging, people cutting across 3 lanes trying to make their exit, trucks trying to maintain speed on the grade. It was chaos. The bridge itself is a steel arch design, and it's actually quite striking when you see it from a distance. But when you're on it in traffic, you're not thinking about the engineering. You're thinking about when you can get across and get back up to speed. The other thing about the Poplar Street Bridge is the views. When you cross it, especially heading westbound, you see the Gateway Arch. That massive, stainless steel arch rising 630 feet above the riverfront. It's impossible to miss. Even at night when it's lit up, it dominates the skyline. The arch was completed in 1965 as a monument to westward expansion, and it's become the symbol of St. Louis. When you see it, you know exactly where you are. I've been across that bridge in every kind of weather. I've crossed it when the sun was setting and the arch was glowing golden orange. I've crossed it in winter when the river was partially frozen and the arch was silver gray against a slate sky. I've crossed it in thunderstorms when lightning was striking the far bank and rain was coming down so hard the wipers could barely keep up. I've crossed it in fog so thick you couldn't see the arch at all, couldn't even see the river below. You just trusted that the bridge was there, that the road would keep going, that you'd make it to the other side. Then, in 2014, they opened the Stan Musial Veterans Memorial Bridge. This changed everything. The Stan Musial Bridge, or the Stan Span as locals call it, carries Interstate 70 traffic. It's about a mile north of the old Martin Luther King Bridge and maybe 2 miles north of the Poplar Street Bridge. This bridge is beautiful. It's a cable-stayed design with 2 enormous A-shaped towers that rise 435 feet above the roadway. The main span is 1,500 feet long. The cables are lit at night, and when you see them from a distance, they look like giant harp strings stretched between earth and sky. When this bridge opened, it immediately took pressure off the Poplar Street Bridge. Suddenly, all that Interstate 70 traffic had its own crossing. The congestion eased, accidents decreased, travel times improved. It was like someone had released a pressure valve. I remember the first time I crossed the Stan Musial Bridge. It was maybe a week after it opened, and I was heading west into Missouri. The approach is different from the old bridges. They built a whole new interchange system on both the Illinois and Missouri sides. The road curves up and around, and then suddenly you're on the bridge itself. The first thing that struck me was how smooth it was. Brand new pavement. Nice wide lanes, good shoulders, and quiet. Well, as quiet as any bridge can be with traffic on it. But compared to the old Poplar Street Bridge, it felt almost serene. The second thing was the view. Because the Stan Musial Bridge is north of downtown, you get a different perspective on the city. You can see the whole riverfront laid out to your right. The arch, the old courthouse, the casino boats docked along the levee, the barges and towboats working the river, and ahead of you, the city of St. Louis spreading out into the Missouri hills. One thing that always strikes me about this crossing is how different the two sides are. On the Illinois side, you're coming through East St. Louis and the other Metro East communities. This area has had a rough go of it over the years. Lots of economic problems, high crime rates in some areas, abandoned buildings. But recently, there's been some investment and revitalization. You can see new developments going up, new businesses. It's still struggling in a lot of ways, but there are signs of life. Then you cross the river and you're in St. Louis proper. Different vibe, different energy. The Missouri side has its own problems, sure. Every city does, but it's the urban core. It's where things are happening. Museums, restaurants, stadiums, businesses, all that downtown energy. The crossing itself only takes a minute or two, but in that minute, you travel between two different worlds. That's the power of the river. That's what a border means. Now, the Poplar Street Bridge is still there, still carrying traffic. Mostly Interstate 55 and 64 now, plus US Route 40. It's still busy, but not the nightmare it used to be. They've done some work on it over the years, keeping it maintained, keeping it safe. But it's an aging bridge. It won't last forever. Eventually, they'll have to replace it or do a major renovation. That's the thing about infrastructure. It requires constant attention. Nothing lasts without maintenance. There are other crossings in the St. Louis area too. The Martin Luther King Bridge, which used to be called the Veterans Memorial Bridge until it was renamed after Dr. King in 1968. This bridge was completed in 1951 and carried U.S. Route 67. It's an older cantilever truss design, kind of industrial looking, but it's still in service. Not as much traffic as the interstate bridges, but steady flow. And there's the Eads Bridge. This is the granddaddy of them all. The Eads Bridge was completed in 1874, and it was the first bridge to span the Mississippi at St. Louis. It was also one of the first major bridges in the world to be built primarily of steel instead of iron. The engineer, James Buchanan Eads, basically invented new construction techniques to build this bridge. They sank caissons deep into the riverbed, deeper than anyone had ever gone before. Workers died from the bends, from decompression sickness, because they didn't understand the physiology of deep diving back then. But they built it, and it's still standing. Today, the Eads Bridge carries the Metrolink light rail system on its lower deck and vehicular traffic on its upper deck. But the vehicular traffic is minimal. Mostly, it's used for the trains. When you see it, you're looking at a piece of history. You're looking at a bridge that was revolutionary in its time and still serves a purpose 150 years later. I don't cross the Eads Bridge often. Not many trucks do. But I've walked across it once or twice when I had time to kill in St. Louis. There's something about standing on that old bridge, feeling the trains rumble past underneath, looking up at the arch and down at the river, and thinking about all the history. All the people who crossed this bridge over the decades, all the changes this city has seen. It puts things in perspective. The thing about crossing at St. Louis is that it's always changing. New bridges get built. Old bridges get renovated. Traffic patterns shift. The city itself changes, growing and shrinking, neighborhoods rising and falling, industries coming and going. But the river stays the same. The crossing stays necessary. And drivers like us keep making the trip, day after day, year after year. One more thing about the St. Louis crossings. The Gateway Arch. I mentioned it before, but I want to come back to it because it's impossible to talk about crossing here without talking about that arch. Eero Saarinen designed it. It was built between 1963 and 1965. The idea was to create a monument to westward expansion, to commemorate St. Louis's role as the gateway to the West. And they succeeded. It's an iconic piece of architecture, sleek, modern, timeless. The stainless steel gleams in the sun. At night, it's lit up like a beacon, but beyond the aesthetics, there's something symbolic about it. The arch is on the Illinois side of the river, right there on the bank. Well, technically it's on the Missouri side, but just barely. The park where it sits is right at the edge of the water. And when you cross from Illinois into Missouri, that arch is saying something. It's saying, you've arrived, you're at the gateway, the West begins here. For truckers, for travelers, for anyone crossing this river, that arch is a landmark. It tells you where you are. It orients you. And it reminds you that you're part of something bigger. You're part of a tradition of movement, of migration, of people constantly pushing forward into new territory. I've seen that arch from every angle, from the bridges, from the Illinois side, from the Missouri side, from the air when I've flown into St. Louis. Each time it's striking. Each time it makes an impression. And late at night, when you're crossing one of those bridges with almost no traffic, when it's just you and the road and the glow of the dashboard, and you glance over and see that arch lit up against the dark sky, it does something to you. It reminds you why you do this, why you keep driving, why you keep crossing these rivers and these borders, because there's always something on the other side. Always another city, another load, another sunrise. St. Louis, the gateway, the crossing point. It's where the East meets the West, where Illinois meets Missouri, where the river that divides also unites. Now let's talk about history. Let's talk about Route 66. Let's talk about a bridge that's become a legend among travelers. A bridge that's no longer open to vehicles, but still stands as a monument to a different era of American travel. Let's talk about the Chain of Rocks Bridge. The Chain of Rocks Bridge is one of the most famous bridges on the old Route 66. It crosses the Mississippi River from Chowdo Island on the Illinois side to St. Louis on the Missouri side. The bridge opened in 1929, built as a private toll bridge. It cost about $2 million to construct, which was a fortune back then, and it had two features that made it unique. The first feature is its length. The bridge is over a mile long, 5,400 feet to be exact, making it one of the longest bridges on the Mississippi. But what really sets it apart is the second feature. There's a 22-degree bend in the middle of the bridge. That's right, the bridge doesn't go straight across. About halfway, it makes a noticeable turn. You can see it from satellite images. You can see it when you're on the bridge. It's like the engineers just decided halfway through to change direction. But they had a reason. The Mississippi River at this point runs through an area called the Chain of Rocks, which is a 17-mile stretch of rocky ledges and rapids. These rocks made navigation dangerous for boats and barges. The river pilots hated it. So when they built the bridge, the boat captains protested. They said if you put massive concrete piers right in the channel, you're going to make an already dangerous stretch even more dangerous. The compromise was to angle the bridge. Instead of crossing perpendicular to the river current, they turned it. This shifted the piers away from the main navigation channel and gave the boats more room to maneuver. It was an elegant solution to a difficult problem. For decades, the Chain of Rocks Bridge carried Route 66 traffic, not the main city route, but the bypass route that went around the north side of St. Louis. Travelers would come across from Illinois, make that distinctive turn in the middle of the bridge, and continue into Missouri and points west. Now, here's the thing about that bend. It was famous. Travelers talked about it. Postcards showed it. It became one of the iconic images of Route 66. But it was also, if we're being honest, kind of a pain to navigate. I've talked to older drivers who crossed that bridge back in the day, and they all tell similar stories. The bridge was narrow, only 24 feet wide with no shoulders, 2 lanes barely. And that bend meant you had to slow down. You couldn't just blast across at highway speed. You had to be careful. For car drivers, it was an adventure. A quirk, something to talk about when they got home. But for truck drivers, it was a challenge. Big rigs don't like sharp turns. They need room. They need space. That bend required focus and skill. One old-timer told me he crossed that bridge pulling a wide load back in the early 60s. He said they had to pull in the side mirrors to make it through. Both directions of traffic had to coordinate so trucks could pass. And that bend, he said, that bend felt like threading a needle. You'd make the turn and your trailer would swing out, and for a moment you'd wonder if you were going to clip the railing. But you'd straighten out and you'd keep going and you'd make it across. The toll to cross the Chain of Rocks Bridge was originally 50 cents. That's about $8 today, adjusted for inflation. By the 1940s, the city of Madison, Illinois, which owned the bridge, eliminated the toll. Free passage for everyone. But by the late 60s, the writing was on the wall. The interstate highway system was coming. Modern, high-speed, multi-lane interstates that bypassed all the old towns and the old roads. In 1967, the new Interstate 270 bridge opened just north of the Chain of Rocks. It was wider, straighter, faster. Traffic immediately started using it instead. In 1970, the Chain of Rocks Bridge was closed to vehicular traffic. For years, it sat abandoned, slowly deteriorating. The bridge deck cracked, railings rusted, graffiti appeared. Nature started reclaiming it, with weeds and small trees growing in the cracks. It became a symbol of the decline of Route 66, of the whole pre-interstate era of American travel. But here's where the story gets better. In 1997, an organization called TrailNet, which maintains recreational trails in Missouri and Illinois, leased the bridge. They spent money and time and effort repairing it, fixing the deck, stabilizing the structure, making it safe for pedestrians and bicycles. In September 1998, the Chain of Rocks Bridge reopened, not to cars, not to trucks, but to people, walkers, runners, cyclists. People who wanted to experience this piece of history, who wanted to make that famous crossing, who wanted to stand in the middle and look up and down the river and imagine what it was like in the old days. Today, the bridge is maintained by Great Rivers Greenway, a non-profit organization that preserves trails and green spaces in the St. Louis area. You can walk across it. You can bike across it. You can stand at that famous bend and take pictures. And on the deck, painted in faded white, you can still see the old Route 66 shield. I've walked across the chain of rocks bridge twice. Both times were in spring, when the weather was nice and the river was high. You park on the Illinois side, down this little road that feels like you're heading into the middle of nowhere, and then there's the parking area and the trail leading to the bridge. The walk starts through this swampy, wooded area. It's quiet. You can hear birds, the leaves rustling, and then the trees open up and there's the bridge. It's narrower than you expect, much narrower. Standing at the beginning, looking across, you can see that bend waiting for you, and you start walking. The river spreads out below you, brown and wide and powerful. Barges pass underneath, pushed by towboats. The current creates these patterns on the surface, swirls and eddies. You can feel the bridge vibrating slightly when a train passes over the new railroad bridge nearby. You can feel the wind, which is always stronger over water. About halfway across, you reach the bend. There's a bike rack there marking the state line, a Missouri Route 66 shield painted on the pavement. And if you stop and turn and look back, you can see the whole bridge stretching behind you, the curve visible, the towers and cables of the modern I-270 bridge rising in the background. I stood there for a long time on my first crossing, just taking it in, thinking about all the travelers who'd made this crossing before me, all the families in loaded-down cars heading west to California during the Dust Bowl, all the truckers hauling goods across the country, all the adventurers and dreamers and ordinary people just trying to get somewhere. They all crossed here. They all made that turn, and now the bridge is quiet. Now it's a place for recreation, for history, for memory. The trucks don't cross here anymore. The mother road doesn't run here anymore, but the bridge remains, and in remaining it tells a story. It speaks of an era when travel was slower, more intimate, more connected to the land. When you didn't fly over places, you drove through them. When the journey was as important as the destination. If you're ever in the St. Louis area with some time to spare, I highly recommend walking the Chain of Rocks Bridge. It's one of those experiences that's hard to describe but easy to appreciate. It's history you can touch. It's the past you can walk through. And it's a reminder that the old roads, the old ways, they're still there if you know where to look. Let's head north now. About 100 miles upstream from St. Louis, you'll find Quincy, Illinois, and just across the river, West Quincy, Missouri. This is another major crossing point, though not as busy as St. Louis. And this crossing has its own character, its own story. Quincy is a river town through and through. It was founded in 1822 and grew up as a trading post and steamboat landing. By the mid-1800s, it was one of the most prosperous cities on the Mississippi, second only to St. Louis in Illinois. The town was a center for commerce, for transportation, for culture. Today, Quincy is smaller, quieter, but still vital, still connected to the river, and still a crossing point for anyone traveling west into Missouri or east into Illinois. The crossing here is handled by two bridges running side by side. The Quincy Memorial Bridge carries eastbound U.S. Highway 24 traffic from Missouri into Illinois. The Bayview Bridge carries westbound traffic from Illinois into Missouri. Together, they form the main crossing in this area. The Quincy Memorial Bridge is the older of the two. It opened in 1930 as a toll bridge. Back then, it cost 50 cents to cross. By 1945, the bonds that financed the bridge had been paid off, and the tolls were eliminated. It's a truss bridge, steel framework creating these geometric patterns. From a distance, it looks like industrial architecture, functional but not beautiful in the traditional sense. Up close, though, there's a certain elegance to it, a certain strength. This bridge is 27 feet wide with 2 eastbound lanes. It's 3,510 feet long. When you're on it, you're aware of the age. The pavement isn't as smooth as modern highways. The clearance feels tighter. You can hear the tires on the bridge deck, that rhythmic thump 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 as you cross the expansion joints. But it's solid. It's been standing for almost 100 years, carrying traffic every single day, and it's still doing its job. The Bayview Bridge opened in 1987, more than 50 years after the Memorial Bridge. This one is a cable-stayed design, much more modern. The cables sweep up from the deck to the tower, creating this fan-like pattern. At night, the bridge is lit, and it looks almost graceful over the dark water. The Bayview Bridge is 4,500 feet long and 27 feet wide, carrying 2 westbound lanes. When you cross it, heading west into Missouri, it feels completely different from the Memorial Bridge. Smoother, quieter, newer. But you're still crossing the same river, still moving between the same 2 states. I've crossed at Quincy dozens of times. It's a good alternative when the St. Louis crossings are backed up, which happens more often than you'd think. Accidents, construction, rush hour, whatever. Sometimes it's faster to go north to Quincy, cross there, and then come back south on the Missouri side. The town of Quincy itself is worth mentioning. When you cross from Missouri, the bridge delivers you right into downtown Quincy. You're immediately in the heart of the city. Old buildings, historic architecture, the riverfront. There's a nice park down by the water where you can see both bridges. On a clear day, it's a beautiful spot. West Quincy, on the Missouri side, is much smaller, just a little community that exists mainly because of the bridge. It's the kind of place that lives in the shadow of its larger neighbor across the river. But it's got its own identity, its own local spots, its own stories. One thing about the Quincy crossing is that it's not as commercial as St. Louis. You don't see as many trucks. The traffic is more local, people commuting to work, families visiting relatives, the occasional tourist checking out the Mark Twain sites in Hannibal, which is about 30 miles south. But when you do cross here as a trucker, it feels more intimate, less hectic. You're not fighting traffic. You're not dealing with 5 lanes merging into 3. You're just rolling across the river at a comfortable pace, taking in the view. I remember crossing here one autumn evening, heading westbound into Missouri. The sun was setting behind me, and when I glanced in my mirror, the whole eastern sky was on fire. Orange and red and purple. The Mississippi reflected all that color, so the river looked like it was glowing. The bridge lights were just starting to come on, and ahead of me, the Missouri hills were silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was one of those moments that reminds you why you do this job, why you spend so much time on the road. Because sometimes the road gives you something back. Sometimes it shows you beauty. Sometimes it makes you feel like you're part of something larger than yourself. The other thing about Quincy is the history. This area was significant during the westward expansion. It was a jumping-off point for settlers heading west. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad during the Civil War era. Abraham Lincoln spoke here during his famous debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. The town has layers of history, and you can feel it when you're there. And the river, of course, always the river. Quincy grew up because of the Mississippi. The town's fortunes rose and fell with river traffic. Steamboats docked here. Goods were shipped from here. Fortunes were made and lost. And through it all, the river kept flowing. Today, the river is still central to Quincy's identity. You can't escape it. It's there in every view, every conversation, every decision about the town's future. The bridges are just the most visible connection, the most obvious way the town stays linked to what's across the water. For truckers, the Quincy crossing is practical. It's a good route, but it's also something more. It's a crossing with character, with history, with a sense of place that you don't always find on the interstates. When you cross at Quincy, you're not just crossing the Mississippi. You're crossing through a piece of America that still remembers what it was like before the interstates, before the franchises, before everything got homogenized. Quincy still feels like a real place, like it has its own identity, and the bridges that connect it to Missouri are part of that identity. A little south of Quincy, you'll find Hannibal, Missouri. And Hannibal is different from every other crossing point we've talked about because Hannibal isn't just a river town. It's Mark Twain's town. It's the town where Samuel Clemens grew up, where he watched the steamboats and listened to the pilots and formed the memories that would later become Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. The crossing at Hannibal is the Mark Twain Memorial Bridge, which carries Interstate 72 and U.S. Route 36 across the Mississippi between Hannibal and Pike County, Illinois. The current bridge opened in 2000, replacing an older bridge from the 1930s that was also called the Mark Twain Memorial Bridge. This bridge is 4,491 feet long and 86 feet wide, carrying 4 lanes of traffic. It's a steel truss through deck design, painted a sort of industrial gray-green that blends with the river and the trees. When you're approaching from either direction, the bridge seems to rise up out of the landscape, tall and substantial. What makes this crossing special, though, isn't the engineering. It's the context. It's where you are. Hannibal is obsessed with Mark Twain, and rightfully so. The entire downtown is dedicated to his memory. There's the Mark Twain boyhood home and museum. There's Becky Thatcher's house. There's the famous white fence that Tom Sawyer was supposed to paint. There are statues of Tom and Huck. The streets are named after characters from the books. Even the riverboat that gives tour is called the Mark Twain. And rising above the town is Cardiff Hill, which appears in both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. The old 1936 bridge used to enter Missouri right at the foot of Cardiff Hill, connecting the literary landscape directly to the real one. The new bridge is a bit north of there, but the association remains. When you cross this bridge, you're crossing through American literature. You're crossing through a landscape that exists in the national imagination as much as it exists on the map. Tom and Huck are real here. The caves where Injun Joe got lost are real. The island where the boys played pirates is real. The river where rafts floated downstream is real. I crossed at Hannibal for the first time probably 15 years ago. I'd read Tom Sawyer as a kid, of course, and I'd read Huckleberry Finn in high school. But I'd never been to Hannibal, never seen the actual place. I had a light load that day and some extra time, so I parked my truck and walked around downtown for an hour or so. There's a touristy quality to it, sure. Gift shops selling Mark Twain merchandise. A lot of references to whitewashing fences and frogs, but underneath the tourism, there's something genuine. This really is the place where Samuel Clemens grew up in the 1840s and 50s. These really are the same streets he walked. That really is the same river he watched. I walked down to the riverfront and looked out at the Mississippi. It's wide here, maybe a mile across. The current moves in that lazy, powerful way that makes you understand why people were both drawn to the river and afraid of it. A towboat was pushing a line of barges upstream. On the Illinois side, trees covered the banks, thick and green. And I thought about Mark Twain's descriptions of the river, how he wrote about it with such authority and affection, how he knew every sandbar and snag, every crossing and bend, every mood and temperament. He was a river pilot before he was a writer. He spent years learning the Mississippi, memorizing it, reading it like a book. That knowledge permeates everything he wrote. There's a passage in Life on the Mississippi where Twain talks about learning to read the river. He says at first, you see the beauty. You see the sunset on the water, the ripples and the colors, the romance of it. But once you become a pilot, once you learn to read the river professionally, all you see are the dangers, the snags indicated by that swirl, the shallow water shown by that ripple, the wind pattern that means you need to adjust course. He says he lost something when he learned to read the river professionally. He lost the romance, but he gained knowledge, understanding, mastery. I've always liked that passage, because that's what happens when you drive for a living. At first, the road is an adventure. You see the scenery, you feel the freedom. But after years of driving, after thousands of miles, you start reading the road differently. You see the signs of trouble, the driver who's about to do something stupid, the weather moving in, the traffic pattern that means an accident ahead. You lose some of the romance, but you gain competence. Anyway, standing there on the riverfront in Hannibal, I felt connected to something. To Twain, yes, to history, but also to the river itself, to this great body of water that has shaped so much of American culture and American life. The Mark Twain Memorial Bridge is usually pretty quiet. It doesn't carry the volume of the St. Louis bridges. Interstate 72 isn't a major truck corridor. Most of the traffic is local or regional. People heading between Quincy and Hannibal, families driving out for the day, the occasional tourist. But every so often, the bridge needs work. In 2024, they did a rehabilitation project that required closing lanes and setting up detours. For a few months, if you wanted to cross the river in this area, you had to go north to Quincy or south to Louisiana, Missouri. The locals complained. Businesses worried about lost tourism. But eventually the work was done and the bridge reopened, smooth and safe for another few decades. That's the thing about bridges. They require constant maintenance. You can't just build them and forget them. The weather beats on them. The traffic wears them down. Steel corrodes. Concrete cracks. If you don't stay on top of it, bridges fail. And when a bridge fails over a river like the Mississippi, the consequences are catastrophic. So the work gets done. The inspections happen, the repairs are made, and the bridges keep standing, keep connecting, keep allowing us to cross. Hannibal, Missouri, Mark Twain country, the place where American literature and the American river meet. When you cross here, you're crossing through layers of meaning, through stories that have lasted 150 years and will last another 150. The river doesn't care about literature, of course. The river doesn't care about Mark Twain or Tom Sawyer or any of it. The river just flows, but we care. We remember. We make meaning. And that's what makes places like Hannibal special. That's what makes the crossing here different from just another span over water. All the way down at the southern tip of Illinois, where the state comes to a point, you'll find Cairo, pronounced Cairo, not like the city in Egypt. Cairo sits at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, making it one of the most geographically significant spots in the Midwest. When you cross from Illinois into Missouri here, you're at the meeting point of three states: Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, the tri-state area. The Cairo-Mississippi River Bridge carries U.S. Route 60 and U.S. Route 62 across the river. It's not a big bridge by modern standards, only 20 feet wide, 2 lanes barely. And it's old, built in 1929, but it's still in service, still carrying traffic. Cairo itself has a fascinating and tragic history. In the 19th century, it was a booming river town. The location at the confluence of 2 major rivers made it a natural trading hub. During the Civil War, Cairo was a strategic military post. Ulysses S. Grant had his headquarters there for a time. The town grew wealthy on river trade, and there were grand plans to make it a major city. But it didn't work out. The 20th century was not kind to Cairo. The decline of river transportation hurt the town. Race riots in the 1960s and 70s devastated the community. White flight emptied out whole neighborhoods. By the late 20th century, Cairo was a shadow of what it had been. Buildings stood empty. The population had plummeted. It became one of the starkest examples of urban decay in America. Today, Cairo is still struggling. The population in 2010 was less than 3,000, down from over 15,000 in the 1920s. Much of the downtown is abandoned, but there are efforts to preserve what remains, to tell the story of the town, to remember what it was. The bridge at Cairo reflects this history. It's a working-class bridge, functional but not fancy. It gets you across, and that's what matters. When you cross it, especially heading west into Missouri, You can look down and see the Ohio River merging with the Mississippi, two great rivers becoming one. The water churns and mixes, brown meeting brown, currents colliding and combining. It's powerful, primal. You're witnessing the meeting of waters that have traveled hundreds of miles to reach this point. The Ohio, draining the Appalachians. The Mississippi, draining the Great Plains. Together, they form an even mightier river that flows all the way to the Gulf. Truckers don't cross at Cairo often. It's not on a major route. Most freight goes through St. Louis or uses Interstate 57 and Interstate 64 farther north. But sometimes you end up down here. Sometimes your load takes you to Sikeston or New Madrid or one of the other Missouri towns in the Bootheel. And when that happens, you cross at Cairo. I've crossed here maybe a dozen times in my career. Each time it feels different from the other crossings. More remote, more forgotten. The bridge itself is narrow enough that you have to pay attention. You can't zone out. You can't let your mind wander. You're aware of the limited space, the age of the structure, the river far below. One time I crossed at Cairo late at night. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. No traffic. No lights except my headlights and the occasional street light on either end of the bridge. The river was invisible below, just darkness, but I could hear it, a low rush, a constant presence. I stopped at the Missouri end and got out of the truck for a minute, just to stretch my legs. The air was thick with humidity, smelled like mud and vegetation. I walked to the edge of the bridge approach and looked back at Illinois. The town of Cairo was mostly dark, a few lights here and there, but mostly just shadows and empty buildings. On the Missouri side, it wasn't much different, rural, quiet, the kind of place that time had passed by. But the rivers were still there, still flowing, still meeting at this ancient confluence. And the bridge was still doing its job, connecting one bank to the other, allowing passage. That's the thing about these southern crossings. They might not be glamorous, they might not be busy, but they're essential. They keep communities connected. They allow commerce to flow. They provide a link when there might otherwise be isolation. The Cairo Bridge is structurally sound, from what I understand. The Illinois Department of Transportation and Missouri Department of Transportation inspect it regularly, but it won't last forever. Eventually, it'll need to be replaced. And when that happens, I hope they keep the crossing here. I hope they don't decide it's not worth it, that the traffic volume doesn't justify the expense. Because places like Cairo need that connection. They need to be part of the network. They need to not be cut off. The southern tip of Illinois, the Bootheel of Missouri, this whole region is sometimes called Little Egypt. The towns have Egyptian-themed names: Cairo, Karnak, Thebes, Dongola. No one's entirely sure why. There are theories. Some say it's because the flat, fertile land reminded early settlers of the Nile Delta. Some say it's because the region sent food north during a famine in the 1830s, playing the role that Egypt played in the Bible story. Whatever the reason, the name stuck. And the crossings here at the southern point of Illinois, they have their own character. They're not as busy as St. Louis, not as charming as Quincy or Hannibal. They're quieter, more isolated. But they're part of the story. They're part of the network that keeps this country connected. When you cross from Illinois into Missouri at Cairo, you're crossing through history, through the rise and fall of river towns, through the meeting of great waters, through a landscape that has seen fortune and misfortune, boom and bust, hope and disappointment. But you're also just crossing, just moving from one state to another, just doing the work that needs to be done. And that's important too. Let's talk about something every driver knows is crucial but civilians often overlook. Truck stops, rest areas, the places you pull in when you need fuel, food, a bathroom, or just 15 minutes to close your eyes. When you're crossing from Illinois into Missouri, especially in the St. Louis area, there are several stops that become regular haunts for drivers. Places where you know the layout, know the food, know you can get in and out without hassle. On the Illinois side, heading toward St. Louis, there are several options. Jack Flash truck stops dot the landscape along Interstate 70 and other routes. These are regional chains, not as big as Love's or Pilot Flying J, but they've got what you need. Fuel, coffee, bathrooms, maybe a shower if you need one. The food is usually standard truck stop fare. Sandwiches, hot dogs, pizza, nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going. There's a Mac 1 truck stop in Frankfort, Illinois, which is well known among Midwest drivers. It's got everything. Fuel, food, a barber shop, even a gaming area. It's one of those places that tries to be more than just a fuel stop. It wants to be a destination, a place where drivers can relax for a bit. I've stopped at Mac 1 maybe half a dozen times. It's always busy, but it's big enough that you can usually find parking. The staff knows the drill. They move quickly. They understand that drivers are on a schedule, that every minute counts. And there's something comforting about that, about being in a place where the people understand what you do, where you don't have to explain why you need to be in and out in 20 minutes. On the Missouri side, just across the river, you've got similar options. Pilot Flying J locations, Love's travel stops, independent spots that have been around for decades. One thing about truck stops in the St. Louis area is that they're busy, all the time. This is a major freight corridor. Trucks are constantly moving through, heading east, heading west, heading north and south. The stops serve hundreds of drivers every day, maybe thousands. I remember one time, must have been about 5 years ago, I pulled into a Love's just west of St. Louis around dinner time. The parking lot was completely full. I'm talking every space taken. Trucks lined up along the edges where parking technically isn't allowed. I drove around for 10 minutes trying to find a spot before I finally squeezed into a space between two other rigs. Inside, the place was packed. Line at the register, line at the food counter, barely room to move, but everyone was patient. Everyone understood. We've all been there, we've all had to wait. I got a cup of coffee and a pre-made sandwich and went back to my truck. Ate sitting in the driver's seat, watching other trucks come and go. Some drivers were just fueling up and leaving. Some were taking their 30-minute breaks. Some were settling in for their 10-hour rest periods. There's a whole rhythm to truck stop life, a culture, an unspoken set of rules. You don't take up a parking space longer than necessary if you're not resting. You don't throw trash on the ground. You keep the noise down at night when people are trying to sleep. You help other drivers if they need it. If someone's having trouble backing into a tight space, you might get out and guide them. If someone's truck breaks down, you might stop and ask if they need help or if they've called for service. It's a community, even though most of us have never met and will never see each other again after this particular stop. The other thing about truck stops is the stories. Every driver has truck stop stories, strange things seen, weird conversations, near misses in the parking lot, characters encountered. I once met an older driver at a truck stop near Troy, Illinois, just before crossing into Missouri. He'd been driving for 40 years. 40 years. Started in the 1980s when the industry was completely different. No electronic logs, no GPS, no cell phones, just a CB radio and a paper atlas and your own knowledge of the roads. We got to talking, and he told me about driving Route 66 back in the day before the interstates took over. He said the road was narrow and winding, and you go through every little town, every main street. You'd see everything. The good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly. It was slower, but it was more connected. You felt like you were part of the landscape, not just passing over it. He said he missed that sometimes. The old roads, the old ways. But he also acknowledged that the modern system is safer, more efficient, better for drivers in a lot of ways. It's just different. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, then wished each other safe travels and went our separate ways. I never saw him again, but I remember the conversation. I remember his perspective. That's what truck stops are. They're not just fuel and food. They're connection points, places where paths cross, where stories are shared, where the solitude of the road is broken just for a moment by human contact. The rest areas along the interstate serve a similar function, though they're more basic. No fuel, no food beyond vending machines, but they've got parking, bathrooms, picnic tables, and sometimes that's all you need. There's a rest area on Interstate 70 in Missouri, just west of the Mississippi River. I stop there sometimes if I don't need fuel but just need to stretch my legs or use the facilities. It's on a hill overlooking the river valley. On a clear day, you can see for miles, the river snaking through the landscape, the Illinois bluffs in the distance, the patchwork of fields and forests. I stopped there one morning last spring, early, maybe 6 a.m. The sun was just coming up, casting this golden light over everything. There were only a few other trucks parked. Most drivers were still sleeping or had already left. I got out and walked around for a few minutes, did some stretches, breathed the morning air, and just looked at the view. Moments like that, they remind you why you keep doing this. The freedom, the scenery, the sense of being part of something larger. You're not just hauling freight from point A to point B. You're moving through the country, you're experiencing it, you're connected to it. And then you get back in the truck, fire up the engine, and keep going. Keep crossing state lines. Keep making deliveries, keep doing the work. But you take that moment with you. You remember it, and it sustains you through the harder times. One thing civilians don't always understand is how much weather affects trucking, how much the seasons change the experience of the road. And nowhere is this more true than crossing the Mississippi River between Illinois and Missouri. I've crossed these bridges in every kind of weather. Summer heat that makes the pavement shimmer. Winter ice that turns the road into a skating rink. Spring thunderstorms that come up out of nowhere and turn day into night. Autumn fog that reduces visibility to almost nothing. Each season, each type of weather changes the crossing, changes how it feels, changes how you have to drive. Let's start with summer. High summer, July and August, when the heat sits on the land like a weight. Crossing the river in summer, you notice the heat shimmer, the way the air distorts above the pavement. The Mississippi looks lower in summer, the water level dropping as the heat evaporates moisture and drought conditions set in upstream. I remember one crossing in late July, must have been 95 degrees, heading westbound on the Poplar Street Bridge. My air conditioning was struggling. The engine temperature was creeping up, not dangerously but enough to notice. And the sun was relentless, beating down through the windshield. When I got across and found a place to stop, I checked everything. Fluid levels, tire pressure, the trailer connections, everything was fine, just a hot day taking its toll. Summer also brings thunderstorms. The Midwest is famous for them. These massive systems that roll across the plains, bringing lightning and downpours and sometimes tornadoes. When you see a storm coming toward you from the west, dark clouds piling up, lightning flickering inside, you know you're in for it. Crossing a bridge during a thunderstorm is an experience. The rain hits so hard you can barely see the road in front of you. The wipers are going full speed and it's still not enough. Lightning strikes close enough that you can hear the crack of thunder immediately. The wind buffets the truck, pushing it sideways. And water everywhere, pouring off the bridge deck, pooling in low spots. The river below, usually brown and placid, now churning with whitecaps. You slow down, you grip the wheel, you focus, and you trust that your vehicle will hold the road, that your tires will keep their grip, that the bridge will stand. Usually it's fine, the storm passes, the rain eases, the sun comes back out, but for those few minutes it's tense. Fall brings fog. River valleys are famous for fog, and the Mississippi River Valley is no exception. On cool autumn mornings, when the water temperature is warmer than the air temperature, fog forms. Thick, white, impenetrable fog that fills the valley and sits on the river like a blanket. Crossing a bridge in heavy fog is surreal. You can't see more than a few car lengths ahead, sometimes less. The bridge seems to disappear into nothingness. You're driving through white space, following the taillights of the vehicle ahead of you, hoping they know where they're going. I crossed the Musial bridge once in fog so thick I couldn't see the cables. The towers were invisible. The river was invisible. I was just following the lines on the road, trusting that they would lead me across. And they did. The fog cleared on the Missouri side and suddenly I could see again. But for those 2 minutes, it was like driving through a cloud. Winter is its own challenge. Snow and ice transform the bridges. The Mississippi itself sometimes freezes, though not completely. You'll see ice floes floating downstream, grinding against each other, piling up against the bridge supports. The bridges get icy before the regular roads because they're elevated. Cold air circulates underneath, and there's no ground heat to keep them warm. So even when the highway is clear, the bridge might be slick. I've crossed icy bridges more times than I can count. It requires a delicate touch. No sudden movements, no hard braking, no sharp steering, just smooth, steady inputs. Keep your speed moderate, give yourself plenty of space, and hope that everyone else on the road is being equally careful. One winter, it must have been December, I was crossing the Poplar Street Bridge during a light snow. The road looked fine. A dusting of snow, but the pavement was still visible. But as soon as I got onto the bridge deck, I felt the truck's wheels lose grip for a second. Just a second. Not enough to cause a slide, but enough to get my attention. I slowed down even more, watched the vehicles around me. A car ahead of me fishtailed slightly, the driver overcorrecting, but they recovered. We all made it across safely, but it was a reminder. The bridges are different. The river is different. You have to adjust. And then there's flooding. The Mississippi floods. It's what the river does. Some years are worse than others, but the floods come. And when they do, the whole dynamic changes. I remember the flooding in 2019. It wasn't as bad as 1993, but it was significant. The river was high for weeks. The water covered the banks. Levees were stressed. Towns were threatened. Crossing the bridges during high water is eerie. The river spreads out, wider than usual. Trees that are normally on dry land are standing in water. The current is faster, more visible. You can see debris floating past. Logs, pieces of buildings. Sometimes boats that broke free from their moorings. And you're aware, crossing that bridge, that the water is close. Closer than usual. The clearance between the river's surface and the bridge deck has shrunk. On some of the older, lower bridges, they sometimes close them during extreme flooding because the water actually reaches the bridge deck. It's not safe. The Mississippian flood is not something to take lightly. It's a reminder of the river's power. A reminder that nature is not tamed, not controlled, no matter how many bridges and levees we build. But most of the time, most days, the weather is fine. Clear skies, normal temperatures, calm winds, and the crossing is routine. Just another bridge, just another state line, just another mile down the road. But every driver knows that the weather can change, that you have to be ready. That the river has moods, and sometimes those moods are dangerous. So you watch the forecast, you check the conditions, you adjust your driving, and you respect the water. There's something else that happens when you cross from Illinois into Missouri. Something you feel but might not be able to articulate immediately. The culture shifts, the landscape changes, the vibe is different. Illinois, especially southern Illinois, is relatively flat. It's prairie country. Farmland that stretches to the horizon. Cornfields and soybean fields in neat rows. Small towns connected by straight highways. There's an openness to it, a sense of space. Missouri, especially as you move west from the river, is hillier. The terrain rolls. There are more trees, more variety in the landscape. The Ozark Mountains start not too far south and west. Even north of St. Louis, the land has more character, more texture. This difference affects how you drive. On the Illinois side, the roads are often straight and flat. You can see for miles. You can maintain a steady speed. It's efficient, but it can be monotonous. On the Missouri side, the roads curve more. They rise and fall with the terrain. You're constantly adjusting, downshifting for a hill, watching your speed on a curve. It requires more attention, but it's also more interesting. The culture is different too. Illinois, being a northern state, has a certain Yankee pragmatism to it. Things are done a certain way. Rules are followed. There's a formality. Missouri, being a border state, has more of a southern influence, especially in the southern and central parts of the state. People are friendlier in a howdy neighbor kind of way. There's a slower pace, a more relaxed attitude. These are generalizations, of course. Every state has internal diversity. Every region has its own character. But the general pattern holds. Cross the river and things feel different. I notice it in the truck stops. In Illinois, the staff is efficient, professional. They get you in and out. In Missouri, the staff is warmer. They'll chat with you, ask where you're headed, tell you about local conditions. I notice it in the drivers too. Illinois drivers tend to be more aggressive. They're in a hurry. They'll tailgate. They'll cut you off. Missouri drivers are generally more laid back. They'll give you space. They'll wave you over when you're merging. Again, generalizations, but patterns you notice after years of driving these roads. The politics are different too. Illinois is reliably blue, especially with Chicago dominating the state's politics. Missouri is purple, leaning red outside of St. Louis and Kansas City. You can see it in the signs along the road, the bumper stickers, the conversations you overhear. But here's the thing. Despite all these differences, there's also a continuity. The same big box stores on both sides of the river, the same fast food chains, the same trucks carrying the same goods, the same highways connecting the same places. We're more alike than we are different. And the river doesn't care about politics or culture or regional identity. The river just flows, and the bridges just connect. One of my favorite things about crossing state lines is the signs. Every state has its own welcome sign, its own way of greeting visitors. Illinois' sign says, Land of Lincoln. Missouri's sign says, the Show Me State. Lincoln, of course, refers to Abraham Lincoln, who practiced law and served in the legislature in Illinois before becoming president. Show me is a phrase that supposedly originated in the 1890s, expressing Missouri's skepticism and pragmatism. Missourians want proof. They want you to show them, not just tell them. These signs are more than just words. They're statements of identity. They're how a state sees itself or how it wants to be seen. When you cross from Illinois into Missouri, that Show Me State sign is the first thing you see, and it sets the tone. You're entering a place with its own character, its own history, its own way of doing things. And then when you cross back, there's Lincoln again, reminding you of the different history, the different identity of Illinois. It's a small thing, a highway sign, but it matters. It marks the transition. It acknowledges the boundary. And for a driver, for someone who crosses these boundaries constantly, those signs become familiar friends. You see them so often they almost become invisible, but they're always there, always marking the crossing, always reminding you that you're moving through geography, through history, through the complex patchwork that is America. Let's talk about now. Let's talk about what it's like to cross from Illinois into Missouri in 2025, because the road is always changing. The bridges age, the traffic increases, new problems emerge, and we drivers have to adapt. One of the biggest ongoing issues is infrastructure maintenance. The bridges over the Mississippi are old. Most of them were built decades ago, and they're showing their age. The Musial Bridge is relatively new, only opened in 2014. That one's fine. But the Poplar Street Bridge, built in 1967, that's almost 60 years ago. The Eads Bridge, 1874. 150 years old. Even though it's been renovated multiple times, it's still fundamentally a 19th century structure. These bridges require constant maintenance, painting, deck resurfacing, structural repairs. And every so often, they need major work that requires lane closures or even full closures. I mentioned earlier the work on the Mark Twain Bridge in Hannibal. That was in 2024. They had to close the bridge for weeks to replace expansion joints and do other repairs. The detours added significant time to any trip through that area. The chain of rocks replacement on Interstate 270 is another major project in the works. The new chain of rocks bridge, which replaced the old Route 66 bridge back in the 60s, is now getting replaced itself. That project is going to take years and cause major disruptions. It's necessary work. Bridges don't last forever. They have lifespans. And when they reach the end of those lifespans, you either replace them or they fail. And bridge failures over major rivers are catastrophic. But for drivers, for the trucking industry, this maintenance is a constant headache. You plan a route based on certain roads being open, certain bridges being available. Then you find out there's construction, there's a detour, there's a delay. And you adjust, you reroute, you give yourself extra time, you deal with it. Another modern challenge is traffic volume. The St. Louis area is growing. The freight industry is growing. More trucks, more cars, more people trying to cross these bridges every day. When the Musial bridge opened, it helped. It took pressure off the other bridges. But traffic keeps increasing. And at some point, you need more capacity. More bridges, more lanes, more options. There's always talk of building additional crossings, different locations, different designs, but these projects are expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars. And getting funding, getting agreement between two states, getting environmental clearances, all of that takes time. So in the meantime, we work with what we've got, and mostly it works. The bridges hold up. The traffic flows, if sometimes slowly. Deliveries get made. The economy keeps moving. There have also been some recent stories specific to this area that have caught national attention. In 2025, there was a big ICE operation called Operation Midway Blitz that targeted truck drivers who were in the country illegally. This operation was focused on Indiana, but it affected Illinois and Missouri too because so many trucks pass through this area. Over 140 drivers were arrested. Many of them had been issued commercial driver's licenses by states like Illinois and California. The whole thing raised a lot of questions about licensing, about immigration enforcement, about safety standards. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but as a driver, I will say this. Everyone on the road needs to be properly licensed. Everyone needs to be able to communicate. Everyone needs to understand traffic signs and signals. That's not about politics. That's about safety. There have also been tragic accidents involving truck drivers in recent years. Drivers who weren't properly trained. Drivers who didn't understand the rules. Drivers who made fatal mistakes. Each one of those stories is a tragedy. Each one represents lives lost, families destroyed. And each one is a reminder of how important this job is, how much responsibility we carry, how much we need to be professional, competent, careful. Most truck drivers are professionals. They take pride in their work. They follow the rules. They care about safety. But the bad actors, the few who cut corners or drive recklessly, they make all of us look bad. They make the public distrust truckers. They make our job harder. So when I hear these stories, I feel conflicted. I'm angry at the drivers who screwed up, but I'm also sad for everyone involved. And I'm aware that we as an industry need to do better. Better training, better oversight, better standards. Crossing from Illinois into Missouri in 2025 means navigating all these issues. The aging infrastructure, the increasing traffic, the political controversies, the safety concerns. It's not just about driving anymore. It's about being part of a complex, interconnected system that's under strain. But we keep crossing, we keep driving, because the freight needs to move, because people depend on us. Because this is the job. We've been talking for a while now, probably longer than I intended when I started. But that's how it goes when you really dig into a topic, when you explore all the layers. So let's bring it back. Let's talk about what it means to cross from Illinois into Missouri, what it really means. On one level, it's simple. You drive across a bridge. You change states, you keep going. Millions of people do it every year without giving it much thought. But on another level, it's profound. You're crossing the Mississippi River. You're crossing the dividing line that splits this country down the middle. You're crossing from the Prairie State into the Show Me State, from Lincoln Country into Twain Country, from one culture to another, one geography to another, one history to another. And you're doing it in a way that countless others have done before you. Native Americans in canoes, French voyageurs in pirogues, pioneers on ferries, travelers in Model Ts on Route 66, truckers in 18-wheelers on the interstate. We're all part of the same story, the story of movement, the story of connection, the story of America as a place where people are always going somewhere, always seeking something on the other side. The bridges make this possible. They're the physical manifestation of our desire to connect, to not be separated by the river, to overcome the natural barriers and create pathways. And those bridges, in all their variety, from the historic Eads to the modern stand Musial, they're beautiful in their own way. Not always in an aesthetic sense, though some of them are genuinely striking, but beautiful in what they represent. Human ingenuity, human ambition, human refusal to accept limits. Every time I cross one of these bridges, especially at night when the city lights are glowing and the river is dark below and the road stretches out ahead, I feel something. Gratitude, maybe. Awe. A sense of being part of something larger than myself. I'm just one driver among millions. My truck is just one vehicle among countless others. My crossing is just one moment in an endless stream of moments. But it's my moment, my crossing, and it matters because every delivery matters, every mile matters, every safe arrival matters, and the bridges that allow those deliveries, those miles, those arrivals, they matter too. So here's to the Mississippi River bridges between Illinois and Missouri. Here's to the engineers who designed them and the workers who built them. Here's to the inspectors who maintain them and the traffic controllers who manage them. Here's to every driver who's crossed them and every passenger who's ridden across. Here's to the river itself, mighty and ancient and eternal. And here's to the road, the endless calling road that keeps us moving forward. That's it for tonight, friends. We've covered a lot of ground, or rather, a lot of water. We've talked about bridges and cities, history and literature, weather and culture. We've explored what it means to cross from Illinois into Missouri, from one state to another, from one side of the great river to the other. But the journey doesn't end here. There are more roads to travel, more states to cross, more stories to tell. Next time, maybe we'll talk about heading south from Missouri into Arkansas, or west into Kansas, or north into Iowa. Each crossing has its own character. Each state line tells its own story. Until then, stay safe out there. Watch the weather, check your mirrors, keep your rig maintained, be patient with the four-wheelers, and remember why you're doing this. Because someone somewhere is depending on what you're hauling. Someone needs that freight. Someone's counting on you to get it there, and you will, because that's what we do. We drive, we deliver, we connect. We're the ones who keep America moving, state by state, mile by mile, load by load. So keep on rolling, keep crossing those bridges, keep making those deliveries, and we'll talk again soon. Same time, same frequency, same stories from the American highways. Safe travels, drivers, and thank you for riding along tonight. The road is calling. Time to answer. See you down the road.